I fit most of those categories. I'm an architect and an activist and an academic. So this is the story of the rise and fall and possible future of public housing, meaning housing that's owned by a public body like a council, not social housing, which includes housing owned by housing associations, and not affordable housing, which means what the speaker wants it to mean. It's now over 3 years since we celebrated the centenary of the Glasgow rent strikes. The urgency of the problems and their solution came to a head because of the First World War. At that time, 9 out of 10 people rented their home from a private landlord. The profit motive dictates that most landlords aim to charge the maximum rent for the minimum expenditure in repairs and in maintenance. That's clear. This rule hasn't changed. Private landlordism is one of the most exploitative relationships of the capitalist system. But the 1915 rent strikers had an answer. Their banner reads, "Only alternative, municipal housing." It's there in the picture. It took a long time for the ruling classes to be persuaded to intervene in the sanctity of the market or of their right to make a profit. But they came to realize that people in poor housing made less efficient workers, and they feared a mass uprising. In 1919, the government passed a law requiring local councils to build the first state-subsidized housing. They argued that this was an insurance against Bolshevism. These homes were well built, but only affordable by skilled workers. These are the first ones in Scotland, which are in Dundee. In the 1930s, they started to build cheaper homes for people cleared from slum housing. And this created a 2-tier system. At the same time, a growing middle class was buying their homes with help from expanding building societies. None of this was enough, and the housing crisis was deepened by Nazi bombing. After the Second World War, the situation was so bad that a mass squatting movement took over now empty army camps. The 1945 Labour government, with Nye Bevan in charge of housing, as well as of the establishment of the NHS, aimed to build good quality council housing for people of all classes. But this ambition was soon cut back due to both shortage of materials and political will. Quality took second place as focus concentrated on the number of homes built. The Conservatives never liked public housing, but by the mid-60s, Labour were also treating it as a safety net for those who couldn't afford to buy. The emphasis on home ownership is actually a very British thing. Most council housing was functional but unremarkable. Some was ill-designed, with no concept of the lives that would be lived there, and also badly built. Little thought and less money was spent on infrastructure and public spaces. Administration and maintenance was distant and bureaucratic. The homes were managed and controlled within a system that tended to look down its nose at council tenants. And there were already problems before the election of Margaret Thatcher. This was published in the late 70s, the booklet shown there. The selling of council housing through the tenant's right to buy was Thatcher's biggest privatisation. Many of the best homes were sold, leaving just the poorest housing for the poorest people. And right to buy continued under New Labour, but has actually now been stopped in Scotland, but not in the rest of the UK. During the Tory years, council housing was starved of the funds needed for even basic maintenance. New Labour inherited the Tory drive for privatisation. Many council houses were demolished and the land sold to private developers. Oh, sorry, I missed it. So the New Labour only made money available for housing transferred from public ownership to housing associations, which, apologies, were more like not-for-profit companies. And the neglected homes lived in by poor communities were easily dismissed as the product of a failed system. In another form of privatisation, many houses were demolished and the land sold to private developers. Reduction of public housing became government policy. Thatcher had repealed rent control legislation, which was first brought in response to that 1915 rent strike. And as public housing was reduced, more people were forced to rent privately. The private rented sector had shrunk to the margins, but is now growing again. Home ownership and property wealth has become a major contributor to growing inequality. Now private rented homes actually include ex-council houses, which are often held as part of property portfolios. So people today face the same problems as in 1915, and the solution can still be municipal housing, but this time it needs to be done better. And we can also use the tax system, and especially land value tax, to restrict homes being used for financial speculation, but I can't really show you that in a picture. Today's municipal housing needs to be managed locally with maximum tenant involvement. Public ownership with cooperative tenant management can help ensure that this continues into the future. And tenants need to be free to personalise their home. Public ownership can also enable design and planning that takes a long-term perspective and isn't driven by a developer's bottom line. There are plenty of examples of good quality public housing. It can respond to demands of community and ecology, and council housing can be a first choice. Thank you.